I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over, and Nicholas Boggs has done an amazing, incredible thing. It's a new biography of the one and only James Baldwin, and it's called Baldwin, A Love Story. First major biography of the man himself in 3 decades. And, I thought I knew quite a lot about my favorite writer, and yes, I will hands down say that James Baldwin is my favorite writer. He is a huge part of who I've become as an adult, and I started reading him when I was quite young. But this book, wait, Nick, this is where I ask you to hold up the finished copy because I only have a galley that I've destroyed. And yeah, like how great does that is beautiful. That is insanely beautiful, that book. But before we get too deep into the man himself, we need to talk about how this book came about, because I'm not kidding when I say you have been working on this book for 3 decades.
Actually, Miwa, I recently learned that it was longer than 3 decades, if you can believe.
Wait, what? What?
So in the course of getting book tour stuff together, I contacted my 8th grade English teacher. I grew up in Washington, D.C.
Yep.
Attended the public schools. And it was in my 8th grade English class, I remembered seeing a drawing of Baldwin on the wall. And there were drawings of Baldwin and Harriet Tubman and major Black figures.
Yeah.
And I just remember seeing this drawing, and his eyes were, even in the drawing, his eyes were so remarkable. So I told my teacher this, and she was like, you don't remember that you came in to do a report wearing a suit to your public school and did a report on James Baldwin's life?
I love this.
Completely forgot that I did this. I still wonder if it's true, but she swears by it. And so actually, it's been a 40-year project, if you count that.
Okay, I'm delighted that little you honed in on a writer like James Baldwin early on. That just delights me to no end. I mean, I was an adolescent when I started reading him as well. And that is something that you and I sort of latched onto very early on when we first met. I mean, obviously you were finishing up the book, but at the same time it was like, wait, what? Are you kidding me? Like, you were that kid too? Okay. But let's talk about the creation of this book, because you are framing Baldwin in a way that he has not previously been looked at. And the way you do it isn't just purely linear. I mean, you're dropping in the books, and it made me reconsider a couple of things, which we'll get to later in the show. But we got to talk about the journey of the book.
Yeah, so the second origin story happened a few years later, and we can go back to the first origin story in Giovanni's when we talk about that.
Oh, yeah, we're going to.
We share that, but we'll get back to that. Yeah, in college, I had read a lot of Baldwin in junior high school and high school, and then in college, I took a class on Baldwin at Yale. The first class I think ever at Yale devoted solely to his work. And we read almost everything by him. But in passing, my professor mentioned this out-of-print children's book. So I went to the Beinecke Library for the first time, and I filled out a form, and they brought the book down, and it was, well, I'll show you later, but it was this beautiful, what looked like a children's book, but it was called a children's book for adults. And there was this illustrator, this French illustrator named Yoran Kazak. So David Leeming had written his very important early biography. He was Baldwin's dear friend and assistant, and he wrote a biography that we're all building on, because it was really, I hate the word seminal, but it was seminal.
It is seminal. No, I've read it multiple times. Yeah. I mean, it is absolutely it is a standard. It is absolutely a standard.
It is an incredible book. And it isn't just the book, but it's the archives that he preserved. We can get into that as well. But anyway, the first email, or one of the first emails I ever sent in my life, was to David Leeming. This was 1996, right? The technology was new. So I wrote a really nice email like, do you know anything about Yoran Kazak? I think I want to write my senior thesis about him. And he wrote back a very polite email, because he's a very polite man. But he said, I never met Yoran Kazak. I don't think anybody is still alive who did meet him. And I'm pretty sure that he's deceased as well.
Right.
So internet searches didn't really exist then. So I kind of gave up. But then 7 years later, I'd moved to New York to start my PhD at Columbia, and I decided to, once again, use that incredible research tool of sending out emails to art historians in Paris, saying, do you know anything about this obscure, deceased French painter? In part because the one paragraph made it sound like they were friends, but maybe more, and he was the godfather to his son, and I just sensed there was more of a story there. So anyway, I send the emails out, And then a few weeks, or maybe it was months later, I'm totally broke because I'm in my PhD. I'm
Hmm.
sitting in my studio apartment in Brooklyn. The phone rings, the regular phone, not a cell phone.
Yep.
We didn't have cell phones. I pick it up, and it's this raspy French accented man saying, "I'm Yoran Kazak. I'm alive. I hear you're looking for me. Come to Paris. I have many stories to tell you about Jimmy." So I signed up for my third credit card, and off I went. And that really was the beginning of a very long journey, both to get Little Man back into print, which
Right.
thank God, happened many, many years later, but it did happen. And then slowly, very slowly along the way, I realized that I was writing a biography, but it did not become that until around 2017. Before that, it was various other kinds of projects.
Right. And Little Man is in print. Duke University Press has it. Wait, you have a gorgeous, gorgeous copy that.
They did an incredible job
Hmm.
retaining the color, retaining the font,
Hmm.
retaining the Baldwin's niece and nephew. It's based on them. So we
Hmm.
had them write an afterword and a foreword that are
Right.
beautiful. And with Jennifer DeVere Brody, I co-wrote an introduction. So I highly recommend this book. It's unusual.
It's. I mean, I love the children's book for adults thing, right? Like, how many times I actually have gifted quite a lot of picture books to adults that I know, um, because they're works of art, right? Like, I mean, this one definitely a work of art. Definitely, in some ways, very French. I think it's great. Anyway, highly recommend. But we're going to go back to your book for a second because you break it out. And I mean, certainly there are names that I recognize from either essays or because, I mean, you can't prep for an interview with a biographer without going back to the source material. So I've spent more than a few weeks. And I mean, what a delightful reason to, not that I really need a reason to go dipping back into Baldwin, but to really read with a different eye and to sort of be reading in tandem with what you're doing and how you're presenting it. I mean, this is such a big, important book. I don't think there are really spoilers in a biography, but I am wondering though, for you as the writer and well, the biographer, right? You're a records keeper in a way, and then you've got to figure out how to tell the story. Like, what does biography start to look like? We live in this world now where, a famous person can go directly to the audience, right? Like, what does record keeping look like? Baldwin left 30 linear feet of archives that are in the Schomburg Center here in New York. And I mean, 30 linear feet, right? That's a crazy amount of paper. But at the same time, like, I'm thinking about the Randall Keenan, the uncollected essays that Keenan put together and whatnot. I'm like, oh, well, this is a treat. Like, you get to dip in and out of stuff that I don't necessarily think, like Baldwin's riff on why he needs to get over hating Shakespeare, which still makes me laugh, is in there and whatnot. And so, for you as a biographer, though, what does the art of biography start to look like as we move into the future?
That's a great question. This isn't exactly how I ended up writing it this way. I can explain, why that happened, but I will
Mhm.
say, um, I was never interested. Part of the reason why it took me so long to realize it was a biography is that I was never interested in writing or reading conventional biographies per se.
Okay, fair.
You start with a childhood, and then you get all the grandparents, and then you chug along, and it's sort of cradle to grave. Even though I do think a totality of a life is worth being captured.
Hmm.
But I also feel that in the case of someone like James Baldwin, or other marginalized writers and figures, the conventional tools of biography don't work. And this can be in part because elements of their lives are obscured, right? Or hidden, and that was definitely the case with Baldwin. And that was something that Yoran Kazak, the discovery of him, led me to see. But moreover, I would say that in most biographies, it's, mom and dad and the kids and how this all impacted their lives. And it's almost psychoanalytic in a sense. And while Baldwin had parents, he actually had a stepfather who called his father and a mother and a family. When he left Harlem, he had to create these alternative kinship structures, these alternative families across the globe, in Paris, in the south of France, in Istanbul, in Corsica. So this kind of family romance model of mother, father, son, and siblings didn't really, it sort of failed to capture the way his adult life worked. By his early 20s, he was pretty much, he would come back, but he was pretty much out of that orbit, as important as his family was to him, what was clear to me in the dedications of his books and in the way that they took shape, that these relationships were so key for him with other men and women, right? And that these creating these communities was also of artists and intellectuals was also really important to him. So I understood that to really tell Baldwin's life story accurately, to go deep into who he was as a person and understand how his writing came out of love in particular, because he wrote so much about love, right? In his
Yeah, yeah.
nonfiction, basically all of his novels are love stories. So how do we come to understand that? And I realized we really have to look at his network of relationships across time.
Why don't we start linearly for a second and then we can, like, I think you and I are going to end up jumping around a little bit. But we've got four key relationships. One, obviously, from New York, one in sort of Paris that also bounces back and forth between New York and Paris. And then we've got Turkey, and then we come back to France. But I think we do have to talk about Baldwin in New York before we go to Europe, although I think there are a lot of folks who just think of him as someone based in Europe and who hadn't. I mean, I remember being slightly surprised that he came back at all, right? And Eddie Glaude said, "Oh, no, no, he just, mama, he missed his mom." And I was like, "Oh, right, James Baldwin and his mom, like he missed his mom." But can we start in New York? Can we start with the painters and how weird Henry Miller makes an appearance in this section of the story?
Absolutely. So I would go back even further. The book
Okay.
begins. The book I won't give too much away, but the book begins with like a 10 or 11-year-old James Baldwin in a
Hmm.
movie theater seeing Betty Davis's eyes for the
Right.
first time in 20,000 years in Sing Sing, and
Hmm.
he realizes that these eyes are his eyes and his mother's eyes, and he's been
Right.
taught that these are the eyes that make him ugly.
Hmm.
And it was a school teacher, a white school teacher, Bill Miller, who took him to these movies and to theater and all of the, and exposed him, talked about books with him. So she is sort of like the first figure beyond the mother,
Yeah,
but the
yeah.
mother is very present there because it's what he's learning about his mother through her. This was a transformative relationship for him. And he says, it was thanks to Bill Miller that I was never able to hate white people, although God knows I wanted to murder more than a few. So she really opened this portal to him, to books and to a life of the mind that was quite beautiful. But the really life-changing one was Beauford Delaney. So he had a friend at school who had met this painter, this wonderful painter who's sort of a icon down in the village. Baldwin writes about this, going down to see him after work one day. He worked at a sweatshop on Canal Street. He crossed over, he went up to his room, knocked on the door, and these amazing eyes were staring out at him. Once again, the eyes of these people. And Beaufort was already an important painter. He was friends with people like Georgia O'Keeffe, but also Marian Anderson. He took Baldwin to backstage to see Marian Anderson. He painted a painting of Marian Anderson in backstage and gave this to Baldwin. He painted the extraordinary nude of Baldwin, who was 16. So Beaufort Delaney was actually in love with James Baldwin at this point, but accepted this kind of paternal spiritual father role that Baldwin gave him. So this is sort of a first example of kinship, right? Kinship beyond blood, the kinds of communities that he had to build, which I think a lot of us now in the world, gay, straight, or otherwise, we have those, right? But it was less conventional back then, I
Hmm.
would say. So Beaufort Delaney transformed him. He taught Baldwin like how to see. There's an incredible story about that Baldwin tells about walking down Broadway together, and Delaney points at a water in a gutter, and he says, "What do you see?" Baldwin says, "I don't see anything." And he says, "Look more closely. Look again." And he sees like the mercury and the sort of the images of buildings reflected in the water. And this was his early lesson in how to see the world as an artist. Unfortunately, then Baldwin moved down to Greenwich Village, which was a
Hmm.
whole important part of his education, to be near Beaufort, essentially, after the death of his father. And then, I'm skipping ahead, but they both applied for fellowships, the same fellowship, but Baldwin got it, and he went ahead of Beaufort to Paris, where he the next figure, Lucien Happersberger, the Swiss, young Swiss would-be artist. He met him there. And that's the man, of course, to whom he dedicated Giovanni's Room and wrote about at great length. And so that he became sort of the central figure of this second part of the book, where Baldwin ends up going with Lucien to his Swiss village where his parents have this chalet, and that's where he writes or finishes Go Tell It on the Mountain. And it's also where he is the only Black person in the village.
Part of what I really appreciated as I was going through Baldwin, A Love Story, and, you know, occasionally I'll read something twice before I sit down, but 616 pages, everyone worth every single minute, but 600. So I've read this once. But having the context in a different way for each of the books, for Go Tell It, and obviously there are more books than the three I'm going to hit on, but, you know, Go Tell It on the Mountain, Giovanni's Room, and Another Country. And I will own it. Another Country is absolutely hands down my favorite. But Giovanni's Room is the book that most people latch on to with Baldwin, regardless of age, when they come to. I mean, I came to it as an adolescent, mostly because I was trying to understand my own gay dad, right? And it was like, oh, hey, here's James Baldwin. And I know this guy from his essays, and what does this mean, right? And I have this, you know, mass market. And mass markets at the time were not printed on acid-free paper, so it's starting to do that thing where it's showing its age. But I'm still very fond of this mass market copy. But there is a moodiness to the language. There is sort of, it's not just a coming of age, right? Like Colm Tóibín has written about Giovanni's Room as well. And he sort of talks about like the debt to Hemingway, and there's a debt to Henry James, and which I don't necessarily think of Baldwin having a debt to anyone, but of course every writer has a debt to another writer, so like, what am I talking about? But seeing how Baldwin's work touches so many people, right? There's a universality to James Baldwin's novels and his essays, and he just pings. I mean, I'm just looking at the two of us on the screen right now, and I'm like, well, we kind of are a little bit of poster children, right, for this legacy that Baldwin's work has left.
Absolutely. When I teach Baldwin, and I think a lot of my colleagues and friends and people out there would agree, to undergraduates, the book that they all gravitate to, you know, is Giovanni's Room. It's because it tells this love story. It's because it's a self-exploration of a young American person who's deeply confused, like so many of us are, by what it means to be American. You know, what it means to inhabit sort of a white body, you know, as an American. This was what he was going through, and to have desires that he can't face. I think these are pretty universal, right? I mean, sexuality doesn't just belong to queer people.
Oh, not at all.
You know,
Not at all.
so he's able to tap into something there that's very universal, and of course the love triangle. You know, to me, what was fascinating researching closely Giovanni's Room, which I did not know until I was deep in the archives, was that this was not a novel. This, for a long time, this was just a short story. You know, and it got sort of at Yaddo, at the artist residency at Yaddo, that he was in the middle of a breakup with Lucien, to who he was dedicating the book, that he kind of realized, oh gosh, this is a novel. So actually it had broken apart from something that later became Another Country. And Baldwin saw all of these novels, including Go Tell the Mountain, like they were all sort of connected for him, you know, as part of himself. I mean, he wasn't coy about the autobiographical elements of his writing either, the way that some fiction writers can be. He fully embraced and admitted that these were explorations of himself, of course, you know, transformed into art and changed.
You have a phrase, it's Baldwin's phrase, but you use it quite often in the book, transatlantic commuter. I always thought of him as an expat when I was younger. And I mean, obviously with time you come to understand that like he did a lot of journalism in the 60s during the civil rights. Like he was in the States quite a lot. There's the whole piece on being in California and writing the screenplay for the Malcolm X film that, let's not talk about Charlton Heston, but you know, he had his moment, but this idea of him as a transatlantic commuter, it's so much a part of his identity, because when you can be the outsider and the insider at the same time, when you can live in exile by choice, right? Like, these are all very deliberate ideas, and maybe he doesn't love every single place he's in. I mean, he certainly loved Istanbul, but like, there's some moments in Paris when he's figuring some stuff out where, he's living in an icky place, or he gets thrown out of an icky place, whatever. Um, but
Goes to
choose,
jail.
it goes to
Yeah.
jail. Well, that kind of wasn't his fault. Um, but the idea that you can be the outsider in your own physical family, like your own genetic family of origin, whatever we want to call them, and yet make something really kind of amazing when you choose exile from that, it's a really profound idea, and it's not something that people at the time were doing. Like, Baldwin was so wildly ahead of his time without ever really thinking about it. He was just like, no, this is who I am. I'm going to go do my thing.
In so many ways, the term transatlantic commuter is so important to him, though, because I mean, it really captures. If you do a diagram of all his travels, and having looked at so many of his letters, I was sort of doing this. It's just like lines back and forth and all over the globe, and back and forth
Mm-hmm,
constantly.
mm-hmm.
So he was not an expatriate. He wasn't even in exile because he came back way too frequently.
Right.
Really
Right.
big moment was when he came back in '57 and made that trip south when he
Mm-hmm.
was radical, and he realized sort of that he really had a calling. He saw himself as an artist first and foremost, but he also understood that what was happening back in the States, like he had the voice, he had one of the voices, right, to really intervene, and he saw that, he called himself a witness to these times. So he had to come back, but he actually hated New York. I mean, you probably remember all those letters. It's like, oh God, I'm back in New
Yeah.
York, and like it's hell. And he just, a lot of us who live in New York, we hate it, but then we love to come back to it. He did not love to come back to it. It was pure. It was a pretty pure dislike. Um,
I think too that's also a product of the moment. I mean, if you're young and black and not necessarily extremely wealthy, it was a really rough place to be. I mean, it was just, New
yes.
York has gone through so many iterations, right? And listen, I miss 90s New York. Oh, wow, do I miss 90s New York? I will own that completely. Um, but I do think that his desire to not be here is completely understandable in the context. I think I kind of wonder what he would be thinking of all of us right now, like if he were here. Like, would he just think we were a bunch of ridiculous children running around, or that maybe we had listened to him to a certain extent? Because when you go back to the novels, right? If you go back to another country, if you go back to Giovanni's Room, or even Go Tell It on the Mountain, Sonny's Blues, like some of the short stories, right? You go back to this work, and certainly the essays, right? All of the essays, a lot of them sound like they were written last week. And this is stuff that was written in the 50s, 60s, even maybe into the early 70s, where you're like, wait a minute, what? How? And I don't know. I mean, you've spent more time, obviously, with the work than I have. I've mostly been reading just as a fan, not as a formal student. But how do we get here with Baldwin? Like, how does he become the writer we know?
I think I think part of it is that his later work
Mm-hmm.
has been reclaimed usefully by writers and scholars in the last decade, really,
Mm-hmm.
like by Eddie Glaude, but by others within, other scholarly works. Ed Pavlik comes to mind.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so I think these later essays are
Mm-hmm.
seen, I think, by a younger generation as really reflecting their experience with the disappointments
Mm-hmm.
of the civil rights movement, the failures of it, not the failures of African Americans in the civil rights movement, but
Mm-hmm.
the failures of the country as a whole to really move into a truly egalitarian, truly socially just situation, right? That Baldwin was fighting for. When he wrote The Fire Next Time, it was this very hopeful, positive, if the conscious whites and conscious blacks can come together like lovers, we can change the world basically. And by the time the early '70s came along, it was clear that this wasn't happening in the way that people had hoped. And so I think, for folks who are so rightfully so frustrated with the police killings of Black Americans, Baldwin's diagnosis of these failures in his time ring very, very true. And so I think that's why these later works, you have to. I like to read them both because I
Yeah.
want to have that hope. I think it's important. I think
Hmm.
Baldwin remained hopeful even later in his life, but I think he was very realistic about what was actually happening in the world, especially like in the Reagan era uh, as well.
Oh, the 80s. I'm waiting for someone to write the book of the 80s. It hasn't happened yet, and I don't think it's because it's too close.
Yeah.
I think you just have to figure out what, like years ago, there was this great sort of the moment history of us called Sleepwalking Through America that Haynes Johnson did. And he was a reporter at the Washington Post 8,000 years ago. And at the time, it was really eye opening. And I have not revisited it recently. So I'm not going to claim one way or another if it holds up because it's been a really long time since I've read it. But I am waiting for someone, hint, hint, waiting for someone to write that epic story of 80s America. Because I do think, in a lot of ways, Baldwin, for me at least, really is. He just runs the spread from about 55 to 75. Like that's how I think of him, sort of at his prime. The work that really sticks with me the most comes out of that particular moment. And sometimes I'm hard pressed to remember that he actually lived until 86. And then there are moments where I'm like, didn't he live into the 90s? Like at that end of his life is just very fuzzy for me.
Well, I hope that my book helps with that because I really
Hmm.
think it's not just me. There's a general sense among sort of Baldwin aficionados
Hmm.
uh, that this final decade was actually very important in a few ways.
Okay.
For starters, he was exploring gender in profoundly new ways that that if Beale Street Could Talk as a novel is a really important. He's writing from the first person perspective of Tish. The novel is actually dedicated to Yoran Kazak. That's another story. But he's really influenced by Black women writers during this period, like Toni Morrison. He reads it out loud to her to see if he's getting the voice right. He's been very close with Lorraine Hansberry and Maya Angelou before. But in the 80s, he's shepherding writers like Gail Jones. He's speaking with Nikki Giovanni. He's having tough conversations with Audre Lorde.
Hmm.
Baldwin was not perfect around feminism at all,
Yeah.
but he was really shifting his conceptions of gender. So even what we think about now is kind of trans theory or trans debates. He in his essay on Michael Jackson. So
Yeah.
he was writing about Michael Jackson. Like he was very much there in the 80s. In one of his final essays, he was writing about androgyny and he was writing about how each of us contains the other, black and white, male and female. And he actually was trying to understand his own identity as in some ways female identified or certainly feminine identified, right? He was really pushing himself in his later years around that. But I also think even something like The Evidence of Things Not Seen, which people generally don't like, but I think it's really interesting because that is one of the first books to really explore what we are living with now, right? Which
Hmm.
is this kind of, it used to be the absence of images of Black people, right? Or negative ones. But that was what we're dealing with now is the saturation of these
Hmm.
images of suffering and violence on our phones, on our television screens. So he was really grappling with that, with kind of the media frenzy around the Atlanta child murders. So I don't think he'd worked it out in his head, similar to gender, but we
Hmm.
really have to give him credit that he was going someplace in both of those arenas that it took us a long time to get to. He saw, I think, what was ahead in terms of violence against African Americans, but also kind of the violence of gender.
I'd argue too, though, that a lot of that comes out of time spent not necessarily off on his own. I mean, clearly a deeply social dude, but it seems to me that by taking himself out of New York and your traditional family structure and spending more time with art and being sort of off kilter a little bit, this is how we get Baldwin. Like, I mean, he's written a couple of plays that some people love, some people don't. There's certainly the screenplay, the Malcolm X screenplay. There is a lot of poetry actually that you've worked with that has the poetry ever really been I think there's one volume of poetry, but has it ever really
Oh,
been collected?
yeah, Nikki Finney edited a really important
Okay.
collection called Jimmy's Blues and Other Poems.
Okay.
I believe that was
Okay.
Beacon. I think that was Beacon Press. She wrote a great introduction to
Okay.
it. Um, but of course, in my book, I also discovered some never before published or never
Mhm.
before seen love poems that Baldwin sent to Yoran Kazak, which
Okay.
were very offered a lot of insight, as do the letters. I mean, I'd say two of the kind of mediums, like we have his published work, but his letters to Mary Painter, his best friend
Right.
in Paris, an American economist, are at the Beinecke, and they are so beautiful and they are so insightful, and they tell
Mhm.
us so much about Baldwin's state of mind and his creative process in particular, because he just wrote to her about it constantly. It also has the great benefit of letting us know where the heck he was, because it's very hard to locate Baldwin. So having these
Mhm.
letters, same with his letters to his dear friend Engin Jazar, right? And where in Istanbul. And Baldwin didn't just, write plays. He also, I mean, I think one of his creative highlights in his life, even though it's little known, was directing Fortune in Man's Eyes, John Herbert's play, in Istanbul in the late 1960s and into
Mhm.
1970. That was a kind of a life-changing experience because he had so many frustrations trying to get movies made and plays off the ground, especially with Hollywood, that, after the failure of the Malcolm X movie attempt, he
Mhm.
kind of tried to kill himself, and then he came to, and he went over to Istanbul, and then he directed this play, and it was an extremely groundbreaking play. It's about sort of prison and queerness, and to be having this play in a socially conservative place like Istanbul at that time was transformative for him, and also for the theater world over there, and for the people. So some of the things that meant the most to Baldwin were under the radar. It
Yeah.
wasn't just the stuff, just the things that we know that we think were important to him.
One of the reasons I was originally really excited about your book too was the Istanbul piece, because if you look at the height of Baldwin's fame really is kind of coming together in that moment, and he was so famous in Istanbul that like crowds would form wherever, like it wasn't he went to Istanbul to like sort of hide out and do the work and whatever, like his
Oh no,
life
he
there.
did. He did. He went there to
Okay.
hide out. It's just that after he
It's
did
not
this
what
play,
happened. Okay.
now what happened, but he did have several years there. I mean, when he came over there, he was able to
Mhm.
finish another country there. He's able to write The Fire Next Time. He's able to
Yeah.
write Tell Me How Long the Train's Been Gone. And Tell Me How Long the Train's Been Gone, ironically, is about a man similar to him, but an actor who's dealing with fame. And then he becomes so famous in Istanbul that he has to kind of leave. He goes to the south of France. He becomes so famous there that he has to kind of sometimes leave. But he also needed to, he always needed, it was this push and pull
Okay.
of different places and different people that
Mhm.
was creatively generative for him. He kind of, he needed this kind of a little bit of drama, I would say, in order to get his work done. Solitude and drama, which are hard to get, hard to manufacture together.
Yeah, well, I'm really glad he did because I got some of my favorite writing out of that period of his life. I mean, honestly, Another Country, man, that opening with Rufus, right, walking through Times Square, and it's so cinematic. And there are other things where I get a little picky with Another Country. It's still an amazing book, but there are a couple of things where I'm like, oh, hello, product of your time. Um, he had,
Well, I would just say
mm,
it's a baggy monster of a book, and I
yeah,
think and so is his last, I believe, great novel, Just Above My Head. But I don't think people always give Baldwin the same benefit of the doubt we give to Faulkner or Henry
yeah,
James
yeah,
or people who write these big, messy, at
right,
times
right.
messy novels. Why doesn't Baldwin get the same um, consideration? Why do we expect like a perfect gem of a book from him when we know that novels don't often come out that way, period.
Yeah. Well, but also Another Country was a much bigger bestseller.
Right.
I mean, Baldwin had fame out of the gate. Go Tell It on the Mountain. Like, yeah, he had to fight with his publishers a little bit to be paid properly. But at the same time, like, once the career took off, it took off. And here he's navigating his own queerness, he's navigating his own sense of Americanness.
Right.
And that's one of the things I always keyed in really hard with on Baldwin in all of the essays is what does it mean to be an American? What does it mean to claim this place, right? That, you know, technically claims you back. But to watch him sort of wrestle with that, 20 and 30 years before some other teenagers might have been wrestling with it, uh, is incredibly liberating in a way. And then also makes you raise an eyebrow at the adults thinking, you guys, none of this is new. None of this is new. But did you surprise yourself? I mean, you're the guy who discovers the children's book for adults. You discover the poetry. You are pinning together, decades of work and connecting the dots. But do you get to be surprised?
I do. I mean, I do. I mean, so a couple, I'll just give two
Mm-hmm.
examples. One is are the Istanbul years. So the wonderful scholar Magdalena Zaborowska wrote an incredibly important book about his Turkish decade there and did groundbreaking research. But there's nothing, I went over there myself a couple times and I spent a
Yeah.
lot of time in those archives. And there's nothing like going there yourself or looking at the dates on all these letters to realize Baldwin spent like that was his home. He talked about it as the greatest home he's ever had. This was not a passing fancy.
Mm-hmm.
He created a community there of outsiders, academics. So I was surprised by just how important those Turkey was to him. The second thing that I brought Little Man back into print with the help of my co-editor and others, and I met Beatrice Kazak, not Baldwin's, Yoran Kazak's wife,
Right.
in 2003,
Mm-hmm.
and Yoran Kazak died in 2005.
Okay.
I had the chance to interview him a lot. Many years later, I go to see her in her home in Tuscany, and she lays out, this is like 15 years after, or 13 years after, 14 years after her husband's death. And she lays out in her beautiful bedroom overlooking the Tuscan hills. The sun is
Mm-hmm.
starting to set, and she's laid out everything she could. And she was so generous and such an amazing person.
Mm-hmm.
And she finds these seven pieces of paper with a rusty paperclip. And I'll never forget the rusty paperclip because it was a reminder that she hadn't read this poem in 40 years.
Wow. Wow.
Okay. And here is a 7-page love poem from her husband to Baldwin called Saturnia, because Baldwin and Yoran had gone to these hot springs for kind of a getaway together in the 70s while they were working on Little Man, Little Man. He'd written it in French because Yoran Kazak couldn't speak English, but I can't really understand French. So she sat there and translated these 7 pages to me as the sun was setting. And it was just kind of an extraordinary moment
Mm-hmm.
because it's a poem that's all about Baldwin being in the south of France and Yoran being in Italy, and Baldwin's waking up and wondering what he's doing. Has he shaved yet? Has he gone to the bathroom? Has he eaten breakfast? Like all of those, how he kisses the pillow at night, pretending it's him, can't wait to come and see him. Uh, and so it's really a poem all about kind of yearning and distance. And it really helped me understand how important those emotions and experiences were to his art. I mean, Giovanni's Room is all about yearning. If Beale Street Could Talk is all about yearning, right? There's the Fonny's is in jail and Tish is trying to get him out of jail. She's pregnant, and in fact, that's a brilliant black heterosexual love story, but it's actually based on this interracial trans country queer love affair. And that's how layered Baldwin is. I mean, that's just how, and that's why you have to look at these relationships to understand how these books got made, how they happened. They would not have happened without these relationships.
Well, I mean, when you think about Baldwin, and again, I'm going back to sort of the period 55 to 75, right? I'm just using that as kind of our vessel, as it were. But the way we defined masculinity in those points, and the language men did not have to talk. I mean, part of what Baldwin is wrestling with when it comes to gender, among other things, right, is this idea that, if you are masculine, there are certain things that are ascribed to that way of being static, however you want to describe it. Like, there are limits. It is a very rigid definition, and same for femininity. I mean, like, we just we're trying to evolve, right? Like, this is what people do. We're trying to evolve, and watching him work within the confines of his social constructs at the time, like America in the 50s, America in the 60s, America in the 70s, what that means, what that looks like. And then you have to layer in the fame because he's got to figure this out in the spotlight. And part of him likes it. And then part of me thinks the other half of him does not like it one bit because there's a lack of language, right? And I want to come back to this this essay that he wrote years ago about needing to stop hating Shakespeare. And he's like, but is it the language that I didn't have, or did I not evolve to meet the language? Like he's wrestling with literal words on the page, and yet it becomes a much bigger idea.
That's a really interesting essay to talk about in terms of gender, actually, even though it's subtext, because that's the essay
Right.
that Eldridge Cleaver really came at him for.
Yeah.
You know, saying that he was self-hating, because Baldwin asked in that essay, I believe, you know, why hadn't a black person created Rembrandt? You
Right.
know, and this is and some, I think Eldridge saw that as an act of self-hatred, you know. But actually Baldwin was writing about when he was young, you know, he was writing about like looking at so-called great literature
Right.
and not seeing himself reflected back, but beautifully discovering it in the blues, in
Yeah.
jazz, in music. You know, he says it was music that taught me, not American literature. You know, that's where he found his voice for Go Tell the Mountain, was listening to Bessie Smith records
Yep.
in Switzerland as the only black person for miles. You know, so this wasn't so what Cleaver was actually seeing in Baldwin was that he was vulnerable, that he was willing to explore his contradictions and the transformation of his self-esteem from when he was young. Baldwin wanted to go into those kind of difficult places within himself that Cleaver, you know, didn't
Was
want.
not going to go. I think we can best describe it as, yeah, he was not going to go in any of those places. But it still brings me back to this impact that Baldwin had, right? Like he was a best-selling writer and he was on television and he was having these conversations with Margaret Mead too. And I mean, there were suburbanites in places in America who like they knew who Baldwin was. Like I remember my parents' friends talking about Baldwin. I remember, and I grew up in Massachusetts, right? So like listening to sort of the adults figure out how they felt about him figuring out his stuff um, made for interesting dinner conversations.
Well, he was, you know, he was beloved by white liberals early on, and then not so much later on. You know, he became uh, disillusioned. He became more radical, and it wasn't he. And this was reflected both in his essays, but also in what he was tackling in his novel, like Another Country, right? Even though it was a bestseller. So Baldwin was, you know, his reputation really went down the hill
Yeah.
in the late 1960s and into the 70s. And a lot of that was because he wasn't saying you couldn't be aligned as much with Martin Luther King as people wanted to align him. He was actually more aligned with Malcolm X
Yep.
by that point. And the murders of both of them only pushed him further away from something that would have been palatable to mainstream America. And he also just wasn't going to write "Go Tell It on the Mountain" over and over again.
No.
You know, he was shifting, he was experimenting. He wasn't. I think he was interested in fame, but he was never going to change who he was or his artistic journey in order to attain it or to maintain it as well.
I love the idea, though, that he follows up what is kind of a conventional coming of age, right? Go Tell It on the Mountain, 14-year-old's birthday from start to finish. And it's a book I love. It is absolutely a book I love. And then he's like, yep, I'm not going to write a sequel. I'm not going to write a follow-up. I'm not going to write it. I am going to write about gay white men in Europe. I mean, essentially, right? I mean, it's the questioning the Americanism or questioning being an American, however you want to phrase it, certainly comes more into play with Giovanni's Room than Go Tell It on the Mountain, but you're still sort of wrestling with status and class and all sorts of things. So the through line is there, but he's like, I'm going to do what I need to do. I'm going to write what I want to write. And then you see more of it come together in Another Country, which, again, a novel
They
that I
absolutely
love.
are. They are all of these. Yeah.
Yeah. But the
Yeah, I mean, I
continuum,
think
right?
there is, because they all came out of the same blobs of writing that he was working on
Mm-hmm.
in his early Paris years. So it makes sense. And he also, he wrote Go Tell the Mountain, and it did well. Yeah, Knopf did not approve of Giovanni's Room,
Mm-hmm.
and so he got on a plane, he took it to the UK, and he sold it there. And just the guts and the bravery this would take at that moment in time, or any time. But I also think he said this later in his life, that one of the reasons that he wrote Giovanni's Room with no black characters, or no obviously black characters, was that
Right.
he wasn't yet ready to handle, as he called it, sort of the black problem and the homosexual problem together. That definitely would happen later in
Yeah.
Another Country. But he again, it's another like nice example of Baldwin sort of admitting, in some ways he was very humble. I mean, he was willing to admit, his struggles with the writing. But of course, Giovanni's Room, in some ways, by going into the tortured heart of white masculinity, it tells us as much or more about race than Go Tell It on the Mountain did. And that's part of why it's universal. It was a really important stepping stone in his development, also because this was a moment in his career where people sort of knew that he was queer, whatever
Yeah.
language you want to use. And as he later said in an interview, he said, "I wrote that novel. If I hadn't written that novel, I couldn't have written anything else." But also, he says he wrote it so no one could blackmail him. He's basically saying, he says this, "You didn't tell me, I told you."
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so it was a way of remaining somewhat mysterious. No one can pin him down, but also being like, yes, I have relations with men. I'm dedicating this novel to one of them. But Baldwin hated all categories. He didn't want to be a Negro writer. He didn't want to be a homosexual writer. He knew that these categories were essential in some ways, but that they were oppressive and they were killing. They were tools of domination.
Well, and you can find the line itself, but there is a line about how oppressor and oppressed sit together. It's in everybody's protest novel, that essay. But you can find how oppressor and oppressed live in the same system, and everyone has to buy in. Um, it's again, it was written a really long time ago, and it just pops off the
So
page,
it's still
pops off
true.
the page now. But I want to go back to Fame and Fashion for a second, because Baldwin, again, like for the longest time, his reputation was absolutely top drawer, top of the class, all of it. But there was sort of a moment where he was rediscovered by the internet, and you and I have talked about this before, and I just want to bring it up on the show because there are a couple of quotes that float around that people are
Right.
saying, "Oh yeah, this is without fail, like once a month they pop up." And yay, let's think about James Baldwin, but at the same time, let's make sure the quotes are correct. And one of them is actually Maria Popova, and the other is actually the novelist Robert Jones Jr. And so, just gonna ask, when you see stuff on the internet attributed to Baldwin, you maybe check whether it is actually written by Baldwin, because we can't chase all of this stuff around the internet correcting people.
Right, we can't. Even though I love that Robert Jones quote. I mean,
It
I
is
love it.
it
Yeah.
is absolutely amazing, and he is a
But it's
great
not
dude.
Baldwin, as Jones himself says. Um, I think it's fascinating. It's been fascinating to watch this happen, because when I
Right.
discovered Baldwin, or really discovered him in college,
Yeah.
he was
Yeah.
in nobody was really talking about him, right?
Absolutely not.
But,
Absolutely not.
but we have to give credit here, I think, to a kind of underground movement that happened among
Mhm.
Black queer artists and
Yes.
scholars. Isaac Julian, for example, his
Hmm.
phenomenal movie film Looking for Langston has Baldwin in it in really important
Hmm.
ways, keeping this kind of archive alive. The rise of
Right.
Black queer studies in the university
Yep.
was really essential in that. And then somehow the mainstream, or caught on, and also, of course, the rise of Black Lives Matters. Baldwin's words became even more resonant,
Hmm.
and that is a positive thing, obviously, in my mind.
Hmm.
But with it, because of the culture and the world that we live in now, there's always the risk that he will become a kind of a soundbite
Right.
instead of looking it's sort of ironic because it kind of takes it back to how he was in the 60s, where people held him up just as this kind of civil rights icon and orator, which he was. But he was also writing these deeply artistic essays and novels, and he really saw himself that way. So you kind of want to not get him repeat that mistake of seeing him in one-dimensional terms. And that's part of what I try to do in my book is say, okay, who was he as a human being? How did he live? How did he love? And what did he learn from these relationships with men and with women, with Black people, with white people, with Turkish people? How did he, unlike so many of us, how was he able to really live a life of community and collaboration across difference? I mean, this is what across race, across class, across gender, across sexuality. These kinds of coalitions are what, I still believe, can help us, this world, recover its humanity, I hope.
Okay, as much as I think, yeah, we could possibly end the show on that note, because that's amazing. I can't let go of this idea, right, that literary biography has weight in ways that I don't want us to lose sight of, right? Like as a culture, I really don't. I worry, because this is not a tiny book, my friend. This is not a tiny book. But the context that it delivers, and I mean new ground, like you cover so much new ground in this book, when it comes to a guy that so many of us sort of feel like we know, right? I'm clear on who Baldwin is through your lens, right? But I'm kind of curious, like, before you go, how you came to these 4 particular people. Like, having read the book, I get it. But like you had to sift through so much archival material to figure out, and in some cases you are parsing it out and piecing it out, because he wasn't like, there are a couple of other people where you're like, well, we just know his name was Richard. Literally, that's all we know. So like, it's not just the volume of material, right? Like you've got to interpret it too.
Yes, and again, I explore many relationships with women, but I was interested in these relationships that had been mentioned and explored somewhat in prior biographies, but there were clearly these big gaps, and it was so clear, how important they were, how these were men who he collaborated with, who he loved, who he was influenced by, who helped him survive, who saved his life, as he said many times. So I felt that these were the ones who would really help us not just fill in these historical gaps in his life, but in these writing process gaps, help us understand how these particular novels and essays came to be. What was he experiencing in Istanbul that allowed him to write The Fire Next Time? What kinds of possibilities for solidarity across different kind of perspectives from a kind of non-Western experience over there was he able to come back and utilize in his writing? But really, it's about love. He loved all 4 of these men, but in different ways. It's not a book that's just about his love life. It is about that, but it's also about love in this expansive sense. The way he talked about it as love is a battle, love is a war, love is growing up. Right? Love takes off the masks we fear we can't live without. This was so important to him. So how did he learn that? Well, he learned that with and through these relationships with these men. So we cannot understand his importance, his process, and what he can still teach us today, hopefully, if we don't look closely at love.
And sometimes love is hard, right? Like sometimes it's just, sometimes love is hard, and sometimes, you got to wrestle with it a little bit. And at least we have Baldwin, and now we have this amazing, amazing biography. Nicholas Boggs, thank you so much for joining us on Poured Over. But also, thank you for doing the work.
Thank you so much, Miwa. It's been such a pleasure to speak with somebody with such an incredible knowledge of this writer. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.